We are very pleased to have with us today Howard Gruenspecht. Dr. Gruenspecht is the Deputy Administrator of the U.S. Energy Information Administration. For those of you who are not aware of that agency, this is a federal agency that is responsible for disseminating independent and impartial information about energy to promote sound policymaking and efficiency in markets. But Dr. Gruenspecht has had quite a considerable career in this field. He has been a resident scholar at the Resources for the Future. Prior to that, was Director of Economic Electricity and Natural Gas Analysis in the Department of Energy's Office of Policy, and had been Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic and Environmental Policy. He has also served with the Council of Economic Advisors as a faculty member at the Carnegie Mellon University and an advisor to the chairman of the U.S. International Trade Commission. He has a BA from McGill and a Ph.D. in economics from Yale University. Welcome to our meeting today, Howard. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for the kind introduction, which I guess proves that I can't hold a job. Before turning to substance, I guess I should note that the Energy Information Administration is a statistical and analytical agency within the Department of Energy. EIA does not promote or take positions on policy issues, but the good side of that is we have independence with respect to the information and analysis we provide. Therefore, my views shouldn't be construed as representing those of the department or other agencies. So we had a lot of discretion regarding the content of these introductory presentations, and I thought of a lot of ideas that didn't make the cut. One idea was to review the history of government policies to promote biofuels in the U.S., Brazil, and the European Union and their economic, energy market, and environmental effects. I was going to call that talk based on Sergio Leone's film, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I won't say which of more there are. That started a young Clint Eastwood, currently more known for his distinguished directing and as a guy who talks to empty chairs. The same title might have also served for my second idea, to review some of the analytical work that has influenced policy development surrounding biofuels. I think that came up in the last question to the previous speaker. And a third discarded idea was to delve into some of the technical pathways, upstream and downstream issues related to the infrastructure to distribute fuels and the vehicles that need to use them. So all three of those topics would have held some interest for the workshop, but they would have required getting very deep into the weeds. The topics, I think, are also all amenable to self-study, which I'm sure the members of this panel or workshop will be doing on their own. Good places to start are some of the recent reports from my agency. We recently put something out called Biofuels Issues and Trends. Also, papers prepared by the Congressional Research Service and several recent National Academy studies on biofuels-related topics. So having identified several roads not taken, my objective today is quite modest and limited. Specifically, I want to place biofuels in the context of the larger energy picture and paraphrasing, I guess, Mark Antony, or at least Shakespeare's version of them. I am not here to either bury biofuels or to praise them. So that's all I want to talk about. I think I can do it in 25 minutes or less. So the first point relates to the current role of biofuels, and I think it also goes well with some of the things Tim had to say. Although the use of liquid biofuels has grown significantly over the past decade, they're still a very small part of the nation's overall energy use and a somewhat larger but still very modest share of the supply of transportation fuels. And the role of biofuels can be considered from several different perspectives. So here's one perspective. This is like the whole U.S. energy picture. And despite the tremendous growth over the last decade, you can see I've pulled out liquid biofuels in red. It still accounts for about 1% of total U.S. Energy use. So fast growth rate, but still from a very small base. It's another perspective on this. One of the motivations for adopting policies to increase the use of biofuels, and there really are many motivations, has been concern over the extent of reliance on imported oil, and whether that's something we should be concerned about or not is not something I'm going to get into. But while we are still importing oil, our reliance on net imports has in fact been declining sharply since 2005. And this is really a buildup of total U.S. liquid fuel use. And the bottom piece of it, net petroleum and biofuel imports, peaked around 2005 at 60%. You can calculate this many ways. This uses the broadest measure. The same measure of import dependence has fallen dramatically. It's in the neighborhood of 40% in 2012, and our latest short-term outlook suggests that it'll be sort of in the neighborhood, slightly above 30% by 2014. Higher production and lower consumption are both contributing to recent trends in this area, and I'll talk a little bit about the longer-term outlook later in the talk. So I want to move from overall liquid fuels, which are mostly used in transportation. 70% of our liquid fuels we use in transportation. But this is focusing specifically on transportation and the use of motor gasoline, which over the past several years incorporates an average 10% ethanol by volume in the United States, or very close to that, had been growing steadily. Motor gasoline is the bottom piece of this picture. And later on in the talk, obviously, my goal is to extend all of these graphics because I was told to give an outlook for biofuels. So I'll just start with these and then give the future. But motor gasoline had been growing steadily until about 2005 and then leveled off for several years and has actually been declining in absolute terms for the past 5 years, but it's still 60% of our transportation energy use. And the declining use of motor gasoline reflects in part the impact of the recent economic downturn on vehicle miles of travel, demographic and behavioral changes that may also be affecting trends in vehicle miles of travel. We know the demographics are affecting it. The question about the behavioral changes is really quite interesting. It also reflects the changing efficiency of the light-duty vehicle fleet, which has increased in recent years, driven by both regulation and market factors, and more stringent fuel economy regulations that have already been promulgated for light-duty vehicles through model year 2025 are expected to have a further impact in dampening the demand for gasoline. So there's a lot going on here, and right now, almost all the ethanol that we use, 98+% of it is used as a blend stock in gasoline. So this graphic considers the role of biofuels in the context of gasoline and distillate, or diesel, the two primary motor fuels. And the growth in ethanol use relative to gasoline is particularly striking, and you can see that ethanol, showing it both by volume and by energy, the ethanol share of gasoline, but by volume, it's about 10% of the, almost 10% of the gasoline pool, and it's about 6 to 7% of the gasoline pool in terms of energy content. Biodiesel plays a smaller role relative to distillate fuel, where both the volumetric and energy equivalent shares are, in the range of 1 to 2%, approaching 2%. Although the Environmental Protection Agency has recently approved the use of gasoline blends containing up to 15% ethanol in all model year 2001 and newer light-duty vehicles, 10% remains the ethanol blending limit for gasoline used in older vehicles, as well as in marine applications and for small gasoline engines used in power equipment like your lawnmower and your chainsaw. I don't have a chainsaw. EPA's initial approval of 15% ethanol blends in newer vehicles has been controversial. I'll leave it at that. And I can certainly say, just as a factual matter, that there's been very little movement toward the wide distribution of blends exceeding 10% ethanol at the retail level. So 10% has been often referred to as the blend wall in this context, and we're kind of there. So, I mean, I'm an economist. What about the economics of biofuels? Two simple metrics are cost per unit volume and cost per energy content, and both ethanol and diesel compete primarily with petroleum-based fuels. The price of those fuels largely reflects the cost of crude oil, and the global price of crude oil rose steadily from 2000 through the middle of 2008, declined sharply over the second half of 2008, and has been generally rising over the past 4 years. And global crude oil, gasoline, and diesel prices were all at a record high annual average level in 2012. So, talking a little bit about the economics of these kind of fuels, ethanol is cheaper than gasoline. This is sort of prices on a volumetric basis, dollars per gallon, and you can see that Iowa ethanol has sort of been floating below gasoline recently. Try to go up almost to the present, and given corn prices, the margins that ethanol producers are earning are actually pretty low, and this is just sort of margins over their variable costs. So I think ethanol producers are having a hard time making returns on their investments. Now, corn ethanol plants are not that expensive, but nonetheless, it's pretty tough for these guys. So this is a volume basis, but if you look at this thing on an energy content basis, it flips over, because a gallon of ethanol has less energy than a gallon of petroleum-based gasoline. So again, these guys are still not making much money. Their margin's the same, but on a sort of a fuel basis, it's more expensive. So the difference has some major implications for the economic prospects of expanding the use of ethanol in high percentage blends or higher percentage blends, where its lesser energy content per gallon would be more noticeable to consumers. And I'll get a little bit more into that later, but not too much, because this is just an entry. One important behavioral question, I guess, is when consumers would start to notice the impact of the lower energy content on the range provided by a tank full of fuel, and take that impact into account in their decisions regarding the choice of fuel. So U.S. experience with blends up to 10% ethanol suggests that consumers look for the cheapest volumes without regard to the lower energy content of gasoline containing ethanol. Effectively, it doesn't matter now, because in the present market, all you can get is gasoline containing ethanol. But in the old days, when you could get either 100% petroleum gasoline or 10% ethanol, a tank of 100% petroleum gasoline take you about 3% farther than a tank of the gasoline containing ethanol. People have not been paying attention to that, or did not when they had a choice. However, experience in Brazil, where high percentage ethanol fuels are sold, suggests consumers definitely make purchase decisions based on energy content pricing rather than simply buying the cheapest gallons when considering such fuels. So there are some interesting sort of economics that'll come into play in this area. This is biodiesel. Biodiesel is a lot, despite the rising oil prices, and you can see the price of diesel, U.S. Gulf Coast diesel, these are wholesale prices, by the way, have been sort of rising dramatically, that brown line in the middle. Biodiesel is more expensive. Again, there have been some tax credits, there's some mandates that I'll get into a little bit that have been causing it to be consumed. And again, currently supported by mandates that require a specified percentage of biodiesel in the overall fuel pool. So turning to trade in biofuels, the United States, and this shows imports and exports on the same graph, the United States had been a net importer of biofuels over most of the last decade, particularly the period 2005, 2006, 2007. You can see the green line is positive, so we were importing. The yellow line is flat. We were not exporting. And we were importing lots of ethanol, and a lot of those imports came from Brazil. And those imports were driven particularly during periods when the phase-out of other octane-enhancing additives created a sharp upsurge in ethanol consumption. But since 2010, the U.S. has actually been a net exporter of biofuels. And in the last 2 years, interestingly enough, as shown in the graphic, we've engaged in a significant two-way trade in ethanol with Brazil. The two-way trade generally involves U.S. imports of sugarcane ethanol and U.S. exports of corn-based ethanol. Significant, of course, the two types of ethanol in terms of their characteristics are really indistinguishable. So significant two-way trade in a homogeneous product is somewhat unusual, and in this case, it's in large part attributable to specific features of federal and state level policies, which provide several types of extra credit for using ethanol produced from sugarcane due to calculations related to life cycle emissions that I think Tim touched on. I won't get into in detail. But literally now we're sending ethanol to Brazil and we're getting other ethanol back from Brazil, which I think is kind of interesting. So federal and state policies are constantly evolving. There were a lot of, certainly since the 1980s really, there have been federal and in some cases state tax incentives for ethanol and other biofuels. There was a federal requirement for the use of oxygenates in reformulated gasoline that I think was intended in the early 1990s, that I think was intended to promote the use of ethanol, but actually in most regional markets, non-ethanol oxygenates outcompeted ethanol. However, again, starting after 2000, ethanol use began to grow significantly as many states responded to concerns about the use of the other oxygenate MTBE and banned it. They were concerned about contamination of groundwater. And then following the enactment of the Energy Policy Act of 2005, refiners decided the liability risks for continuing to use MTBE were too large and phased it out on a national basis beginning in 2006. So the phase out and the availability of tax incentives drove the ramp up that I think I've shown in the earlier graphic. But it's still, even with the big ramp up, it's still a pretty small piece of the whole picture. And that goes back to some things that Tim had to say. So I'm not going to give a quiz on this, but here's the summary of the current Renewable Fuel Standards Program, reflected in the 2007 legislation. Sets a series of annual targets for various nested groups of biofuels. The number that people remember probably is a 2022 number for total biofuels, which is 36 billion gallons, of which 21 billion, reading across the bottom line, falls in the category of advanced biofuels, and 16 billion falls in the category of cellulosic biofuels. Obviously, it's early days in this program, but I think the particular column of interest is, I guess, the cellulosic one, and we haven't had much success in producing cellulosic biofuels. I think that's a fact. And EPA has modified, and they have the authority to do so, modified the statutory goal in each of the years through 2012. So, for instance, in 2012, instead of 500 million gallons, they set a goal of like 10 million gallons. And the 2013 one, it's already 2013. I assume that the regulatory process will work its great progress and they'll come up with a goal for 2013. It's supposed to be 1 billion gallons. It's going to be a lot closer to, I can't say. I don't know exactly what it's going to be. I know that my agency is required by statute to send a letter to EPA saying what we think could be produced, and we thought it could be, could produce 10 million gallons. And these numbers in red, even though they're much lower than the statutory goal numbers, they themselves have been, significantly overestimating the amount of cellulosic biofuels that's actually being produced. And you'll notice that the numbers in the statutory column really rise pretty rapidly. So like by 2016, I think we're supposed to have 4.25 billion gallons of this stuff. And, it's a tough slog. I will say that. Leave it there. So we're a statistical and analytical agency, and it's really different from most statistical agencies. We do have a specific mandate to provide forward-looking analyses as well as data. So I want to turn to the much more daunting task in my last 8 minutes of providing an outlook for biofuels, what the organizers asked for. You know, the preface of the 2011 National Academy report on the Renewable Fuel Standard, and again, the chairman of that committee before his untimely death, you know, is my good friend and colleague Lester Lave, who I think brought me to Carnegie. I never knew who decided that I should go to Carnegie Mellon, but I think it was Lester. Most of the other people there are much more theoretical than both Lester and me, so I assume he was the one who brought me there. But the preface begins with a famous quotation from Niels Bohr: "Prediction is hard, particularly if it's about the future." You know, I and others at EIA use that same line quite a bit. Energy projections can be wrong for any number of reasons, including assumptions about economic growth, energy market developments, energy technology improvements, changes in consumer preferences, and energy policy developments, only to name a few. So, yes, I will give you an outlook, but, you know, unlike what I've discussed so far, which is statistics and data, you know, who knows? So, I'll be clear about that. This is the summary points of our latest reference case. You can read them faster than I can. The reference case, again, generally assumes current laws and regulations and does have technological improvements, but they're only trend improvements. We're not guessing when breakthroughs will occur. My talk today will only consider the reference case, but the complete outlook, which will be released this spring, includes many alternative cases in recognition of the uncertainty inherent in making projections about energy markets. So let me just briefly, so this is the overall, you know, you'll recognize the part up to 2011 as the overall energy picture. You know, everything to the right of the 2011 line is our projection. And again, we expect overall energy use to rise pretty slowly. I think that's pretty clear. There's a lot of energy efficiency going on in this country. Primary energy consumption doesn't get back to the 2007 level until about 2022. You know, growth in energy use is pretty slow. You know, renewables do meet a large share, and by renewables, of the growth in energy use. And renewables includes both renewables excluding liquid biofuels, which grow from 8% to 11% by the end of the projection, and also the liquid biofuels, which we do have growth in liquid biofuels, but nothing like the targets in the legislation, in part because some of the issues related to cellulosic ethanol. The fossil fuel share of total energy consumption does decline, but it's still pretty significant in this projection under current laws and policies. And obviously that has some implications for climate change and other things. And you know, some growth in liquid biofuels, but it's still a small picture. Oil and other liquids actually does decline in both percentage and absolute terms. So that's an interesting, I think, observation. So there are other alternatives to oil beside biofuels. So this is, again, transportation sector. You know, I think the thing to look for here is that despite continued growth in travel, you know, we expect light-duty vehicle energy consumption to decline pretty significantly. So most of the light-duty vehicle stuff is gasoline, and you can see that motor gasoline is kind of dropping in absolute terms throughout this period. And in fact, as a share of transportation energy, it falls from 60% to like 47% in this projection. You know, so again, this notion of efficiency versus fuel, not versus fuel shifts, but efficiency and fuel shifts as sort of alternative, you know, ways to address oil. This is oil production. Tight oil is sort of and this is conservative compared to some other estimates, but there's a view, I think, that a lot of domestic crude oil production, you know, is available. The tight oil production has been growing very dramatically. I think even our very front end we would raise, actually relative to what's shown up there, based on what we've seen. So again, this is consumption of liquid fuels, and again, this is an extension of the other picture you've seen. So we don't expect the reliance on net petroleum and biofuel imports to, rise where it was in 2005. We see it remaining, well below 40% throughout the entire forecast period. And if we do have some additional cases with a more robust domestic production outlook, as well as additional improvements in fuel efficiency, additional fuel switching to alternate fuels in a wide variety of transportation applications. And it's certainly conceivable that reliance on petroleum imports in the U.S. would fall well below these reference case projections. A situation in which the United States uses no net imported liquid fuels is a stretch, but it's certainly not beyond the realm of possibility. So here is our projection for biofuels themselves, and you can see that for 2022, we don't get really anywhere near the 36 billion level, the legislated level, and our reference case projection shows a much lower level, and you'll notice the cellulosic biofuels are not approaching the 16 billion gallons of cellulosic biofuels. So it's but over time, we do expect, as the price of oil goes up, and we do expect it to continue going up over time, and as technology improves, we do expect more biofuels to come in. So again, 2 closing scene setters, but I don't really have to do these, so I'll leave it to the moderators. You want to give me another minute and a half or not? Hello, moderators?
Where I guess,
I can stop.
could you take a half a minute and close?
Excuse me?
Could you take a half a minute and?
Half a minute, okay. So anyway, one thing to keep in mind is that, I already laid out this notion that fuels markets are really complex. So like ethanol played 3 different roles, volume, octane source. People had to have it when they phased out MTBE. People would pay anything for it. You couldn't sell fuel unless you had enough octane in the fuel. It didn't matter what it cost almost. It was a small percentage of the fuel. You had to buy it. Volume enhancer is where ethanol has been. The next segment is people have been, it's like hamburger helper or something, in the sense that, you put in this stuff, it has lower energy content per unit of volume, but people don't notice. So it was a deal, energy content provider is a harder market. And again, we see significant challenges because of the blend wall, the availability of some of the things I touched on earlier. The last one is that, clearly biofuels intersect multiple public policy issues, which is why I assume it's of interest to this group. So again, petroleum import dependence, one thing I focused on because I think it's what my agency is involved in. Greenhouse gas mitigation, I think Tim talked a lot about some of the pros and cons there. But then there are all these other policies that I know little about, but that people in this room know a lot about. So with that, I'm done, and I thank you very much.
Thank you so much.